pass a bill
Yeah.
on that?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Because it's in the rules, right? That
Yeah,
the-
yeah, house rules.
Okay, so the LBB just doesn't get to decide?
No.
We can instruct LBB?
No, I mean, the LBB, the actual officials, the Legislative Budget Board, they could decide. They decided in 1991 to change it to performance-based budgeting. Like, the way the budget is done is from a 1991 change. Before then, it was done on like a kind of weird line item program level. So the way, like, technically that you're appropriating money can be changed, but then there would be House rules that would have to change and Senate rules about when you consider things, like how do you have hearings and how do you have, maybe even how you do the subcommittees. They might get into that. They might not get into that nitty-gritty detail, but yeah, you could change all of that. I don't think you'd have to amend the Constitution to do any of this, but if you have to, then go ahead and do that. They're amending it for all kinds of other rinky-dink things. But yeah, how you make people pay attention to the things that matter, that you can figure out a way to do.
What did you mean when you talked about the budget process was changed in 1991 to performance-based? What do you mean by that?
Performance-based budgeting is, in theory, the idea that a legislator, I'm not going to micromanage you, a state agency. I'm just going to give you money, and you're going to meet performance measures, and if you do a good job, then you'll be continued to receive funding. Like, I'm not going to tell you, like, you have to spend this amount of money on payroll and this amount of money on office rent. You do whatever it takes to get the results. So you see performance measures in the budget, outcomes, outputs, cost per Medicaid client, percent of people happy with their experience with the regulatory. So just like performance measures. And Texas was one of the first states that switched to performance-based budgeting. And the problem is that you're not going to stop funding the prison system just because it's doing a terrible job. Yeah. So everybody knows it's not really about the performance measures. It's who knows who and who wants to put a new prison in your district or whatever, because some contractor wants to sell the state a lot of cement. So the switch to performance-based budgeting is, in theory, supposed to ensure that agencies do the best, the most efficient thing they can do. But in reality, it's like, no, it's how much money do we have? Like, the session starts off with the controller giving the revenue estimate. So how much money do we have, and then what do we need to do at a bare minimum? So like how we fund schools is something they back into. They know what they want to do and how much money they have. So that's just like you back into school funding. You don't set out to say, how could we have the best funded system in the world that is equitable? If they started by asking that question, then you'd see a very different outcome. So, but it's like, what do we want to do for everything else, and then whatever's left, let's just hope that property taxes go up enough to cover the rest of it.
The backing in is so, I remember being like 27 years old and dealing with the privatization of the refugee resettlement program from Texas Health and Human Services through ORR. And I asked the Texas Health and Human Services staff for their budget and how much money they requested from the state for refugee cash assistance and things like that. And the numbers weren't adding up, and finally I got on the call with one of the policy analysts, and she's like, we just back into those numbers. And I'm like, how am I supposed to go to the federal government and tell them I need $112 million and we just backed into those numbers? Like, this isn't being an adult.
Yeah.
And she's like, this is how we do things in Texas. And I'm like, this is why it's all broken.
Yeah.
Like, this had nothing to do with the number of refugee families we had to feed that month.
Right, and that's exactly how they did the cuts in 2011 for education as well. They figured out how much they wanted to spend, and then they created something they called the regular program adjustment factor, which was a multiplier to multiply towards the regular program to cut it down to the level that they wanted. So it was all arbitrary numbers. They just backed into how much they thought that they could spend and figured out how to make the math work from there.
Yeah, how can we get $4 billion out of the formulas and $1 billion out of the grants? And like the grants programs, the ones that are still there are the ones that had more political support. The Buffalo Soldiers or communities and schools. It's like, no, don't cut those, cut everything else. So it's not about what works better or what really makes a difference. It's who can make the case politically for not cutting something. But yeah, just across the board cuts, that's the other thing. You'll see like percentage across 5% cuts, 7% cuts, 12.5% cuts. That's like the lazy way of cutting. You just assume that everything there is equally worthy of cutting. It's like, no, we could cut some things 100% and nobody would miss it. And other things, even 0.5% is going to be really bad for everybody who needs that. So pretending that everything that's being done is on the same, like the same priority or the same level of funding to begin with. Anything that's not funded adequately to begin with, why are you even talking about cuts to that? But they'll pretend that that's the way to make it fair. Everybody gets an across the board cut. It's like, when, like you said, if you didn't even start out by saying, this is the need that we're trying to address,
Right.
and this is how many people out there need this. If you don't ever start by having that conversation, then anything that follows is just pretend. Or the other thing in performance measures, they'll just redefine the measure like client served. If you see numbers in the budget estimates or the LARs where all of a sudden the client served goes up tremendously, make sure you look at the cost per client, because if you used to serve a client $100 a month or something, and then all of a sudden it's $9, it's like, okay, well, you used to let them go see a doctor, and now you're just giving them a brochure.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
you still call it client served,
Yeah.
but it's just not, it doesn't mean what it used to mean. So anytime you see something really funky going on, it's like, oh, they changed the performance measure. They could have said so. Yeah, the alternatives to abortion program, you see all kinds of bizarre things happening. And it's because they're defining, like, who is a client and what is a service and all of that. So all of that matters.
So the Senate keeps pushing for zero-based budgeting.
Tell me about zero-based budgeting. That's a new term for me.
Well, zero-based budgeting is a thing that actually exists. That's part of performance-based budgeting. All of this goes back to
It's like you basically just start with zeros, right? Supposedly, like.
Well, that's how Perry interpreted it, yeah. So the idea is that in any performance-based budgeting system, you should have levels, like percentages of one, basically. So like, let's say 100% of your funding is what you're currently getting. So that process should let you ask for 110%.
Yeah.
Or 95%. Or 30%, like all the way down to zero. So you should be able to like incrementally say, for this much more or less, I will give you this much more or less outputs or outcomes. So performance-based budgeting, that zero base is a part of that. But the way Perry